We're really pleased to have today as our faculty member, Dr. Michal Raucher, JTS Fellow and Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. I'll introduce her more fully in a moment to talk with us about the question of, is there a Jewish continuity crisis? Before we begin, just a few technical announcements. First of all, I want to thank Rabbi Tim Bernard, our Director of Digital Learning, for facilitating the session and the program, and all of the community engagement team who've been part of putting this series together. And you'll be getting an email actually later today letting you know about 4 new sessions that we're adding onto the series. So we're really very excited about that. And as I mentioned at the last session, we're planning to extend the series into August. Okay. If you, just technical issues, if you would like to focus on the speaker, on Dr. Raucher, rather than seeing the gallery of everyone, you probably know how to do that by now, but at the top right corner, you can click speaker view or gallery view if you do want to see everyone, but speaker view will allow you to see Dr. Raucher and whoever is asking a question. Regarding questions, we're going to use the raise hand feature in Zoom. So to find that, click on participants on the bar at the bottom, look for the hand icon, click the icon to raise your hand, click it again to lower. Feel free to test it out. Tim will call on you when it's your turn, and then you will unmute yourself to ask your question. If you're participating by phone, you can raise your hand by dialing *9. If there's any screen sharing today, just so you know, there's when the screen is shared, you'll see Dr. Raucher one side and whatever she's sharing the other side, and you can move back and forth the vertical line if you want to see one or the other of those 2 images, bigger or smaller. Okay, and I just wanted to say also, as we start a session today in the series called Times of Crisis and Possibility, that I think we all know, and we've all seen over the last couple of weeks, that we are again living through a time of crisis and possibility. And I know that Dr. Raucher will address that briefly before her teaching, but it just seemed important to say that as we're exploring such times in our series, times where there were issues that were severe enough that were costing lives, that were ripping society apart, that were leading to major restructuring, and discernment of values. All of those things are at play in the United States right now. So I have that in the back of my mind as we approach today's session, and I'm sure, or the front of my mind, I'm sure that many of you do as well. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Michal Raucher, who, as I said, is a JTS Fellow and Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers. Her research lies at the intersection of Israel studies, Jewish ethics, and the anthropology of women in Israel. And she's also published on sexuality and gender in Judaism, religion and bioethics, abortion legislation in Israel, and female religious advisors on the internet. As a Fulbright Fellow, she conducted ethnographic research on reproductive ethics of Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox women in Israel, and this led to the publication of her first book out recently, Conceiving Agency, Reproductive Authority Among Haredi Women in Jerusalem. And she's now working on a second book, Tapping on the Stained Glass Ceiling, the Ordination of Orthodox Jewish Women in Israel and America. And her full bio is on the source sheet that you were sent, and I'm going to leave it there for the purposes of time, although I have to mention that she's, of course, a JTS alum, a graduate of our joint program with Columbia University. And Michal, this is not in your bio, but you also launched the MA in Jewish ethics at JTS. So we're really indebted and grateful to you for that. Dr. Raucher.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman, for that wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me? Just a thumbs up or a nod if you can hear me. Okay, wonderful. So it's so great to be spending this time with all of you. I want to thank Rabbi Andelman for that great introduction. I'm sorry I don't have the MA bio. I don't know what thing out. I should put that back in. It's a good one. So thank you to Rabbi Andelman. Thank you to JTS for hosting this great conversation, for the whole series of conversations. I'm sure many of you have been at previous sessions, and I've attended a few sessions as I could, and they've all been really, really great. Thank you to Rabbi Bernard, to Stacy and Tani, and the whole team at JTS for putting this together. This is just a really great series, and I'm honored to be a part of it. And of course, thank you to all of you for being here. Just in terms of starting the session, it is worth mentioning that it's been a tumultuous few months with the coronavirus pandemic, and it's been a particularly challenging 2 weeks since George Floyd's murder. As a white Jewish woman who's involved in thinking about reproduction and women's health, I have been thinking quite a bit about what my responsibilities are to Black women. And in honor of this session, I will be donating to 2 organizations that help Black women and mothers. If you are so moved, I encourage you to do the same. I will put their links in the chat. The first is National Bailout. National Bailout is a Black-led and Black-centered collective of organizers, lawyers, and activists who are building a community-based movement to end systems of pretrial detention and ultimately mass incarceration. There's a large percentage of women who are held on bail who are mothers, and I want to get them back to their children. So that's number 1. Number 2 is the Black Women's Health Imperative, which targets the most pressing health issues that affect Black women and girls in the United States. So I will link to those 2. And the other thing is that I have been doing a lot of reading about lately. I just listened to a podcast this morning. I was trying to figure out what specifically to recommend if you wanted to learn more about Black women's health, and particularly maternal mortality rates, which are much higher for the Black community. So if you want to learn more about these unique challenges that Black women face, I recommend this interview that I just heard this morning with Layla Saad and Kimberly Ehlers. Kimberly Ehlers has written and researched quite a bit about Black women's maternal health. She has a book coming out soon that collects Black women's experiences giving birth in the United States and the structural racism that they face. So give me a second while I just copy these links and put them into the chat. Hold on, everyone. There we go. 1, that's the National Bailout. This is the Black Women's Health Initiative. And this is the podcast that I recommend. Okay. Great. And there are many more resources. If you go to that podcast, you'll see a link to many more resources. So on to our session. We as Jews express a great deal of concern about our demographics, about our reproductive rates. Some say this concern came out of a modern political Zionism. You might have heard of the demographic war with Palestinians or Arabs, as they're often referred to. Others suggest it's a post-Holocaust phenomenon. The demographic concerns get louder and quieter at different points in time. They seem to have risen significantly after the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, which revealed that the Jewish population claiming to practice some form of Judaism was at about 4.4 million. An additional 1.1 million identified themselves as Jews by birth, but did not consider themselves religious. So this 5.5 million is considered by the State University of New York demographer Barry Kosman, who conducted the NJPS, to be the core Jewish population. The survey confirmed earlier estimates of a high intermarriage rate. 52% of Jews who marry are married to non-Jews. Equally disturbing to many was the fact that 60 to 70% of that core Jewish population, around 3.5 million people, were not affiliated with any synagogue. These figures have instilled a grave concern for the future viability of Jewish life in America. Due to anxieties about the extent of Jewish assimilation in America, Many Jewish organizations and philanthropies have created programs and schools that focus on Jewish continuity. One of them, which you've probably all heard of, was Birthright. Birthright came out of this concern for Jewish continuity. And the idea was to keep Jewish people within communities and networks of other Jews. So in response to the 2013 Pew portrait of Jewish Americans, we started hearing this concern again. And now if we could start, I know everybody should have the sources, or you could download the sources, they're at the top of the chat. But we can also screen share them so we can all look at them together. Tim, could you screen share the sources? Let's start. Is there a first page? There we go. Okay. So in response to the Pew Survey in 2013, we started seeing this concern rise up again. And this is just a sampling, really a tiny sampling of the kinds of articles and op-eds that we started seeing. And they're coming from both, they're coming from demographers, social scientists, they're coming from Jewish thought leaders, this concern that intermarriage and low fertility rates among Jews was leading to a continuity crisis, and it became termed this continuity crisis. So here's what I want to make 2 points during our time together, and then we'll stop about halfway through for questions, comments, etc. And then in the end, you can tell what I but this is one, the current way we think about continuity in terms of demographics is problematic. If we look at the reproductive rates more closely, we'll see that there's a more nuanced story to tell. The nuanced story tells us more about what the crisis really is all about. But moreover, our emphasis on demographics as the key to continuity is also problematic because it's painful to people who do not have children, cannot have children, and have not had at least 2 children, et cetera, et cetera. And we risk defining who's valuable in the Jewish community by who has 2.1 children, which is the magic reproductive rate number. Okay, so that's point number 1, that the current way we think about continuity in terms of demographics is problematic for those 2 reasons. Point number 2 I want to make is that the language of crisis makes it seem like all of our energy, our funds, our education, our programs should be directed toward solving this crisis. But in many ways, our tradition, our laws, our cultural norms challenge the idea of crisis when it comes to demographics. In other words, we have expressed values that are more important than reproduction. We talk about pru urvu, be fruitful and multiply, as the most important value. But I hope to show that there are other values that are very important and have competed and continue to compete with pru urvu. We've prioritized learning and health in rabbinical sources, as you'll see, and we prioritize bodily autonomy as well as many other things today. So I'm hoping to get to those 2 big points during our time together. So let's jump right in. Thinking about Jewish demographics is problematic. So we can go to the next page. Okay, here's a main chart about fertility rates from the Pew Survey of 2013. So just as a reminder, because 2013 I've realized is now 7 years ago. That's a very long time. So the Pew surveyed approximately 3,400 Jews in America. Jews of no religion refers to Jews who were raised Jewish but say they have no religious affiliation as adults. There are about 22% of those within the Pew survey. Replacement level, thank you for making that larger. Replacement level is 2.1. That's when I mentioned the magic number. And that's because even though in a traditional 2-parent family, you'd need 2 children to reproduce that exact number so that you'd replace Jews who are lost. we assume 2.1 is a reproductive rate because we build that in because not every woman will reproduce or survive to reproductive age. Okay, what do we learn from these numbers? These results are based on births reported by male and female survey respondents, which is unique because usually only women are surveyed about this, but these results are similar to what others have seen when women alone are surveyed. The number of children rate is, and it's a good measure of what demographers call completed fertility. Sometimes demographers use reproductive rates or total fertility rates, which are estimates of how many children you're going to have. But it's important, particularly among Jews, to do a completed fertility rate from ages 40 to 59, because many Jewish women have babies later in life because they have higher rates of education, which again we'll get to a little bit later. So these rates, all to say that these rates are rather accurate. Okay, so Jewish adults ages 40 to 59 report having an average of 1.9 children. You'll see that's the net, compared with an average of 2.2 children per adult in the same age cohort of the general public. So it's just slightly below. Jews by religion average more children, that's 2.1, than Jews of no religion, 1.5. Then here's what I really want to emphasize here. We talk about a continuity crisis in broad strokes among Jews. Here's what I think people are really getting at. The average number of children born to Orthodox Jews is 4.1. That's twice the overall Jewish average. Maybe you know this already, that Orthodox Jews have a higher reproductive rate, okay? But there is no continuity crisis for Orthodox Jews. By contrast, Reform Jews have 1.7 children and conservative Jews have 1.8 children on average, still not much lower than our 2.1 reproductive rate. Jewish respondents married to Jewish spouses have more children on average than Jews married to non-Jews, 2.8 versus 1.8, and married Jews have more children than those who have never been married. Christians tend to have more children than Jews, but only slightly. Christians tend to have 2.3, Jews 1.9, and it breaks down differently according to Christian denomination. After the Pew Survey came out, there were a series of other studies around Jewish continuity, like the one we're going to look at. The Jewish Policy Institute, or JPP, independent policy planning think tank in Israel. The mission of the Institute is to ensure the thriving of the Jewish people and the Jewish civilization by, I'm quoting here, by engaging in professional strategic thinking in Jerusalem, but they think about the Jewish people globally. Okay, so here's what the JPPI says in 2017 after they conduct some of their own research. The absence of children, particularly, I'm reading source number 2 here. The absence of children, particularly children being raised in the Jewish religion, represents yet one more missing incentive to Jewish communal engagement. Since religious child-rearing has been a major stimulus for religious engagement in general and for Jewish engagement as well, major portions of the adult Jewish population not only postpone mentally pass through their adult lives without experiencing a familial to affiliate with synagogues or other Jewish institutions. Clearly, it is critical to understand the factors making it more likely that younger Americans will marry, create
Michal?
Is my internet connection okay? I'm seeing some, are people having trouble?
We're losing you a little bit. Do you think you can switch to phone audio?
You're losing me entirely?
You're dropping out every now and again.
Okay, you know what? Let me try taking out my headphones.
I think it's your internet connection.
Maybe that, hold on.
Okay, can everybody hear me now? Can you hear me a little better?
I'll let you know if it goes out again.
Okay, let me know, thanks. It might have just been my headphones. They sometimes give me trouble. Okay, I apologize if you didn't hear me. I was reading source number 2 just now. I want to point out that the argument here is flawed in a few ways. They say here that religious child rearing is a stimulus for religious engagement. And without children, there will be no reason for Jewish adults to engage in Jewish institutions. But we know from the Pew Survey that many Jews do actually have children, somewhere between 1 and 2 children on average, which means some are having more, right? So presumably they will want to engage in institutions to raise their child, even if it's just one, in a Jewish way. The problem, therefore, is not that Jews are not having children. It's that Jews are not engaged, as they say, in Jewish communities. So what does that mean? They're not supporting synagogues or other Jewish institutions. When we talk about a continuity crisis, we're actually saying we're not comfortable with certain Jews having a higher fertility rate than other Jews, because it means that those with the lower fertility rates will go extinct. Therefore, what we're really concerned about is a continuity crisis regarding ideologies and institutions. The question, phrased more specifically, is, will there be conservative Judaism in a few generations if conservative Jews are not reproducing at the replacement level? The question is really about the continuity of a specific movement and its institutions. Focusing on fertility rates for women overall is a way of placing blame for the drop in membership of a movement on women's reproductive habits. But it's also a way of obscuring the fact that ideas and institutions are born, evolve, and die through time. The Pew Survey resulted in a series of conversations about the value of this language and the problems with it. And here I want to bring you just one example, or actually I have 2 examples, one from Sheila Katz, who's the CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women. She's responding specifically to a statement of Jewish vitality, which was published in eJewish Philanthropy in 2015. In this statement of Jewish vitality, which was composed and signed onto by Jewish thought leaders from around the United States, they referred to the low birth rates as, quote, a challenging context. And here's what Sheila Katz had to say. In response to this statement on Jewish vitality, this is source number 3, I dislike being referred to as a challenge. How horrific it must be for Jewish continuity that I'm an unmarried Jewish woman without kids. The agenda outlined is smart, but we need people to feel welcome in order to participate. Let's start by referring to single people and those in intermarried relationships and marriages as people of value in our community. We are not a challenging context. Rather, we are an incredibly beautiful and vibrant part of the Jewish community at large. If only people started treating us that way. Now, Sheila is a powerhouse in the Jewish community. She's leading a movement of Jewish women, of those who are allies. And she names that the concern is that more Jews aren't active in community institutions, but she says that one way of encouraging people to become active is not to focus on what they've done in terms of reproduction, but to focus on other values that they bring to the table. How's my sound? Can everybody hear me now? Is my connection okay? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay. I'm going to bring one more critique of the continuity crisis language, and that's from Stash Kotler, who is the CEO of Bend the Arc. She's been with Bend the Arc for many years. And she gave this wonderful talk that's linked to, you can watch the whole talk, about critiquing Jewish continuity in 2014. I just want to bring you actually to the last few sentences. She says, she learns about Jewish continuity initially is that it's this focus on, will they marry Jewish? Will they raise children Jewish? Will they join a synagogue? Those are the kind of questions that somebody out there seems to be thinking is important in the Jewish conversation when it comes to continuity. And yet from her work with the Jewish community, what she's found is, and I'm going to bring you, I don't know how many lines up this is, but there's a series of questions, and then it starts many Jewish communal institutions. Go further down, it's at the end of the question, it might be on the next page. right up at the top. Many Jewish communal institutions. Okay. Many Jewish communal institutions may have become out of sync with the majority of Jewish Americans. They have become potentially out of sync with our values and our politics. We know that American Jews, by and large, hold solidly progressive views on the most pressing domestic issues of our time, whether that's our, role in democracy, our broken and immoral immigration system, LGBTQ inclusion, the fact that there's a shameful gap between the richest and the poorest people living in this country. We know that 81% of American Jews favor taxing the highest income earners, which include many of us in this room, myself included, because we understand that revenue stream plays a role in supporting and preserving those precious safety net programs that protect the most vulnerable people living in this society. We know that 56% of American Jews say that working for justice and equality is the very essence of what it means to be Jewish. And yet, our Jewish communal institutions spend between 1% and 2% in direct advocacy on social justice issues that, again, the majority of Jews say is the essence of what it means to be Jewish. This is in contrast to the much larger percentage of funds that are spent on the Jewish continuity crisis. Stash here reframes the main problem within the Jewish community. She says that despite language from institutions about a demographic continuity crisis, many Jews think there are other crises that as Jews they are obligated to solve. And she names a number of them here. So before I get into some of the other values that the Jewish community has held dear for centuries, I want to pause, take a break for some questions, comments, conversation. So let me hear from you.
Brandy? Let's try table.
Hi, thank you. Just a quick question. The 2.1 figure, does that also account for, may not be true as much for Orthodox women, but within other movements, there used to be reports that Jewish women, due to higher education levels, reproduced at later ages. Does the 2.1 account for an age discrepancy too?
Great question. So 2.1 is the magical replacement reproductive rate across all populations. In other words, if you want a population to reproduce and sort of stay stable in terms of its numbers, then each woman needs to reproduce at a rate of 2.1 children. But to your other point, it is true also across all demographics that the higher, and this is something I'll get to in a few minutes, the higher the education rate of women, the lower the fertility rate. And that's true for Orthodox women. It's true for women all over the world, actually. It's something that demographers and women's rights advocates have pointed out for a couple decades already.
Elaine or Charlie?
Yeah, it's Charlie. I was just wondering, with regard to the very low level of spending on social justice issues, whether there's a breakdown by denomination, because my sense is that the reform movement, which I'm part of, puts a particularly high emphasis on that aspect of being Jewish.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I think, so that talk was in 2014. And I think you'd actually see higher rates now, 6 years later, because I think social justice issues have moved to the fore, not just in the reform movement, I think also in the conservative movement. There are also a number of social justice organizations for Orthodox that are run by Orthodox Jews that have also come out of various crises in our wider community. So I think you'd see a higher rate. I don't know by denomination. That's a great question. Yeah.
Shraga?
I just want to make a comment. I think my thinking is that the Orthodox community is motivated by an unstated agenda. And that unstated agenda is replace the 6 million. That is, they're not only are they interested, of course, in having children to expand their movement, but in the United States, but they also have an eyeball on the arc of Jewish history. And that demands that we increase the number of Jews in the world generally.
Yeah, true among certain Hasidic sects of Orthodox Jews. In my research, the women who, Hasidic women that I spoke to, evoked the Holocaust as a reason for their high reproductive rates. But there are also a lot of other cultural reasons for high reproductive rates. Sometimes it's just social pressure, social expectations and norms. And there are a lot of cultural reasons why those reproductive rates are dropping, actually. I think actually that number of 4.1 for Orthodox Jews is rather low, considering what most people think about when they think about ultra-Orthodox Jews and their reproductive rates. My research on reproduction is based, my ethnographic research is based in Israel, and there we've seen a drop in reproductive rates among ultra-Orthodox Jews for a variety of reasons that I'll get to a little bit later.
Thank you very much.
Sherry Bloomberg?
Thank you. I'm really appreciating your research and your interpretations of it. For those of us who are barren women and could not give birth, adoption and often raising families that are larger because of foster childcare is not often recognized, and that could be an interesting area of study. We had 2 Jewish foster kids. We adopted one who, of course, was from the time of birth ours, and then we also have one non-Jewish foster kid. So, what do you do with a family like mine?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for raising it. There are a couple of books I can recommend, scholars who've done research on adoption in the Jewish community. I agree that it's actually an under-researched area. I think there's a lot to say about the acceptance or non-acceptance of adoption in the Jewish community and in different Jewish communities. Oh, I'm very sorry. I thought I turned that off. So I can recommend some books. If you write to me afterwards, I can point you to some people who have written on it. But I agree. And at one point, actually, before I got into research on Orthodox women who have received rabbinic ordination, I was planning on writing a book about adoption. So it's a big interest of mine, and I'd love to see more work on it. Thank you.
Dale Brown?
I wanted to ask what kind of reaction there was to Katz's statement about child-free women and that she didn't like being considered devalued. I think I really appreciate you bringing it up, because this is something I've experienced pretty extensively in the Jewish community, and I've heard complaints from others. And I just wondered if there was any thoughts of a communal response, maybe just thinking about what the Jewish community can do in terms of continuity and other things, so that child-free women, women who are not attached, women who are past childbearing age, and couples, who aren't going to have children can be part of it.
It's a great question. Rabbi Andelman invited me last year to give a version of this talk to rabbis in congregations across the United States. And one of the suggestions I passed on to them that I had heard from child-free women and child-free men was specifically to pay attention to, and I don't know if this answers your question because it's really specific, but it gets at a larger problem. When it comes to synagogue activities, often we charge, if an event is $25 for a single person to attend, it's $36 for a family, or $36 for a couple or something like that, right? Which means that you're in a better position, or you're more, it's more financially something, right? It's better to be paired. The message is it's better to be paired than to go as a single person. And so one of the suggestions that I passed on to these rabbis was to pay attention to your fees structure, right? And what messages are you sending in your fees structure? But I think this gets at the fact that, do we have programming in synagogues for adults without children? And often we don't until you get to a certain age. But for a 30-year-old without children, there's not much. I don't know many synagogues that are doing active programming for adults who don't have children. So that's just kind of one suggestion I could pass on. Maybe we could take one more question and then we'll move on to the rest, so we have time at the end.
Marla?
Thank you. My question is whether you could elaborate a bit on the point you started to make about sometimes the continuity crisis becoming more a question of being concerned about the continuity of the conservative movement, and kind of your thoughts on the importance, or, to what extent we need to be concerned with the conservative movement continuing.
Right. So I think if you just look at reproductive rates, I actually think you don't have a huge problem with continuity for the conservative movement. Once you factor in other things, and I actually don't know these other numbers, how many people leave the conservative movement, but Pew Survey has them, right? You could look at them. How many people over the past 10 years have switched movements? That's a different question altogether. But that's not a question about reproductive rates at all. That's a question about, what values movements are, holding people to. How do people feel attached to movements? Why do people affiliate? How do they affiliate, right? That's a much larger, complex sociological question. Yeah. And so I can't answer it right now, but I think it all I'm saying is it's not a question of reproductive rates. And the focus on reproductive rates is a way of obscuring the larger problem and placing blame on women and the choices that women are making in terms of their reproduction. Okay, should we move on? All right, let's share. So here's where I want to get to this fact that the Jewish community has actually held a lot of other values that often compete with reproduction. And here's, I'll tell you a little bit about my book. So my book that's coming out in just a few months, you can pre-order it now on Amazon. My book is based on interviews I did with Haredi women, with ultra-Orthodox Jewish women in Jerusalem. And what I discovered while talking to them about their reproductive practices is that women make decisions about when to have children and how many children to have based on a variety of factors. These include things like a family's financial stability, her health, her educational aspirations, her work, right, her professional success, because many of you probably know Haredi women in Israel work to support the home. Her relationship with her husband, all of these are factors that will determine, I know there was a little conversation in the chat about birth control, will determine when they use birth control and for how long and whether they get an abortion. All of these things are absolutely part of their reproductive practices, and these various values are competing with their also desire to have large families. So all of these things are part of the conversation. I've written a lot about that, and I'm happy to get into some of that during the Q&A if people want. But what I was curious about after coming home from Israel and writing the book was whether these other values were unique to the lives of Haredi women in Jerusalem. So I started to do some research for a chapter I was writing on contraception in Judaism and how contraception has been talked about in Jewish texts. And what I discovered was that we can see in Jewish texts and Jewish history the presence of values that often compete with childbearing. So here I'm going to bring a couple of rabbinic texts, and I'm not a rabbinics expert. I'm an anthropologist. So I read these texts really with a different view, right? It's not halakhically, it's a way of viewing them to see what values underlie these statements. So if we can share the screen, I want to go to source number 5. Thank you, Rabbi Bernard. Okay. This is from the Mishnah Torah. Men are obligated in procreation, periah urevia, but not women. You may have heard this. When is a man obligated in this mitzvah? From the age of 17, the Rambam says. Once he reaches the age of 20 years and has not married, he has transgressed and neglected a positive commandment. However, if he is involved in Torah and engrossed in it, and he fears that if he marries, he will have to busy himself with supporting a wife, and thereby come to neglect Torah study, then it is permissible for him to delay marriage. For one who is involved in a mitzvah is exempt from another mitzvah, all the more so regarding Torah study. Here, the Rambam supports the preference for Torah study over marriage and procreation. Marriage and procreation would require him to leave Torah study because he would have to work to take care of his family. But here, Rambam puts both of these mitzvot, pru urvu and Torah study, on equal ground, but as mutually exclusive. Also in this chapter, later on, a couple of verses later, Rambam clarifies that pru urvu refers to having a boy and a girl. What's interesting is that many rabbinical authorities actually disagree with the Rambam about this, about being able to delay marriage for the sake of Torah study. But the demographic data reveals that education, and now I'm sort of fast forwarding to the last 70 years or so, education and subsequent socioeconomic status have been a significant factor in determining contraceptive use. Furthermore, many studies have shown that a woman's education is inversely related to her fertility rate, which is what I alluded to before. And Sylvia Barrick-Fishman, who was one of those who had commented on the continuity crisis in one of the earlier articles I pinned up above, did research on demographic trends of Jewish women from the 1950s to the 1990s. And she notes that increases in education among Jewish women led to a significant drop in fertility because women postponed childbearing until their 30s and then reached post-reproductive, post-childbearing age before they could get to a fertility rate that was as high as women who had started reproducing in their 20s. So if your age of first pregnancy is higher than average among Jewish women, it's likely because of higher rates of education. So again, what I want to point out here is that this value, even though many people disagree with Rambam, following his statement that one could delay marriage for the sake of Torah study, this is a trend that has actually caught on in significant ways, pointing to the fact that Jews do value education. And if you're valuing education, right, and thank God valuing education for women, and we can talk actually about, oh my goodness, so interesting, about how Orthodox Jewish women who are getting ordination, right, are getting very high rates of education and resulting in a lower fertility rate among women. So if you're valuing women's education, then it will result in a lower fertility rate. These values work in opposite ways. So that's one thing. That's one value that I want to point out. The next, this is source number 6. This is from the Bavli, from the Talmud Bavli and Ta'anit. Similarly, Reish Lakish said, "It is prohibited for a person to have conjugal relations in years of famine, so that children not be born during these difficult years. As it is stated, and to Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine came. It was taught in a baraita, nevertheless, those without children may have marital relations in years of famine, as they must strive to fulfill the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply, pru urvu. The Talmud in this Masechet is concerned about scarcity of resources. Thinking about this today, we have to think about childbearing in the context of financial security of the individual as a competing factor to childbearing, right? So the text is wrestling with the individual requirement of pru urvu and the communal concerns of scarcity. And they're trying to figure out how to balance those two competing needs. How does somebody fulfill the mitzvah of pru urvu when the community is in a position of scarcity and it's not a good idea to bring more humans into this world, right? What I hope we see here is a negotiation of these values. How do we think about calls for increasing reproductive rates in the context of financial scarcity, climate change, et cetera, et cetera? These are all competing values that we see our texts wrestling with as well. And today wrestling with, individuals are wrestling with these same questions today. Now I want to point to a statement from the RA from about a year ago, which was in response to the Human Life Protection Act, which was also known as House Bill 314, or the Alabama abortion ban. This Alabama statute was set to impose a near total ban on abortion in the state starting in November 2019, but a legal challenge against the bill delayed its implementation. In the bill, a doctor who performs a banned abortion in the state of Alabama could be sentenced to life imprisonment. And there were very few exceptions, particularly for the case of rape and incest. These exceptions were rejected by the legislature. So the RA put out a statement in response. Actually, one of the governor, or the bill's sponsor rather, hoped that this bill would be a legal challenge to Roe v. Wade. And I know the court is considering some cases. I don't know if they're considering this one. I forgot to look that up. But the RA, in response a year ago, said, the Rabbinical Assembly is deeply troubled by the enacting of today's abortion law in Alabama and believes it should and will be struck down by federal courts. Reproductive freedom is again under assault in our nation, beginning today in Alabama, where the state has effectively banned abortions at every stage of pregnancy and criminalized the procedure for doctors. It is further under attack in other states' so-called personhood acts and life at conception acts, including Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Ohio. This position is based on our members' understanding of relevant biblical and rabbinical sources, as well as tshuvot, modern rabbinic responsa. And here's where I want to get at the balancing here, the negotiation. Jewish tradition cherishes the sanctity of life, including the potential of life which a pregnant woman carries within her, but does not believe that personhood and human rights begin with conception, but rather with birth, as indicated by the book of Exodus in chapter 21, verses 22 to 23. Rabbis of the conservative movement make it very clear here that they believe in reproductive freedom and the idea that personhood begins at birth. In other words, the leadership is not opposed to abortion, even though they value the sanctity of human life. They're recognizing these sometimes competing authorities, competing values, right? And expressing a clear preference for one. I'm bringing also, as my last few sources, some data from surveys done by the American Values Atlas. And I want to bring this data to show that this kind of negotiation, this attitude that expresses bodily autonomy and a respect, a recognition of abortion, I want to show that that's a value held by many Jews, not just by rabbinical authorities, although I could bring you many rabbinical authorities who express that. So these next three results are from a recent survey of the American Values Atlas. They did 50,000 telephone interviews. They actually do these interviews annually in order to get a lot of detail about cultural and religious landscape in America. So here, you'll see here, I think these are really interesting to look at. The first one we're looking at is, in your view, should government health insurance program for low-income women like Medicaid cover the cost of birth control or not? And you'll see that if you go down, 5 columns in, you'll see that Jews say yes by 85%. It's one of the highest rates, just behind New Age religions and hovering around unaffiliated and Hindu and Buddhist. But you'll see that Jews overwhelmingly support government health insurance programs supporting the cost of birth control. The next one, do you think abortion should be? And the options are legal in all cases, legal in most cases, illegal in most cases, illegal in all cases. And legal in most or all cases, right? Jews are, what is that, 70%? My math is correct? Yes, about 70% legal in all or most cases. That's a huge percentage, almost one of the highest. So Jews are overwhelmingly supportive of the legality of abortion. Jews believe in bodily autonomy. And remember that this Jewish population is not all, remember back from Pew, right? They're not all referring to halakha when they're making their decisions. These are things that they hold because of social norms or other ethical values or whatever it is, but Jews are overwhelmingly supportive of the legality of abortion. And even one further, right, in your view, should government health insurance programs for low-income women cover abortion? And Jews, 71% of Jews say yes. I just think it's really important to pay attention to the fact that Jews therefore are prioritizing things other than reproduction, not just for themselves, but for other people. They recognize that these other values are important, whether it's education or women's health or financial stability or the fact that there's a scarcity of resources. Any one of these issues is held high by Jews, not just for themselves and their own reproductive rates, but for women all over the country. There are historians also that I could point to if you're interested. I'll send you some resources, historians that have shown that Jewish women in America have supported women's access to birth control and abortion. Jews are supportive of bodily autonomy, and they support giving women access to bodily autonomy from a variety of economic and social groups. So the last thing, and if anybody's been watching Mrs. America, you'll see that, half of the women in the feminist movement were women. Were Jews, rather. So that should tell you something as well. Okay, the last thing I want to bring is a few books about Israel, about this context in Israel, and how scholars, when we write about reproduction in Israel, we talk about pronatalism, that the government has held a pronatalist stance towards in particular. And here's where notably the demographic war with Palestinians comes into play. So these are 3 books. I'm plugging my own here too, shamelessly. The first is Reproducing Jews, if you want to do a little more research about reproductive rates in Israel. Susan Martha Kahn in 2001 did ethnographic research about infertility treatments and the fact that Israel has the highest rate of fertility clinics per capita than any Western country. She goes on to say that, Israel has this history of pronatalist policies. In 1950, David Ben-Gurion instituted what was called a Heroines Prize, and this was for a woman who gave birth to her 10th child. And that's just one example there, but there are a variety of policies that have been instituted by the government to encourage Jewish women to reproduce. And Susan Martha Kahn does this research on fertility treatments, and she sees that these same values are being played out in the increase of fertility treatments, the rise, their access, the fact that they're paid for by the government. up to the birth of 2 or 3 live children. So again, she's showing how pronatalism plays out in this other way. At the same time, even though the government has had these pronatalist policies since the Yishuv days, actually, right, since before statehood in Mandate Palestine, the next book that I recommend came out more recently, written by Lilach Rosenberg Friedman, who gives us a historical account of Mandate Palestine, where she shows that the Zionist ideology was not sort of simply pronatalist. Many Jewish men and women during the Mandate period practiced various forms of contraception, abortion being one of the most popular forms of contraception in the 1930s and 40s. And actually, there are a lot of other scholars who have spoken about that's because pronatalism in Israel is focused on certain women reproducing in certain ways at certain times, and certain babies being born. We can fill in what all of that is. But if we look at Israel's current abortion law, we'll also see that abortions are permitted until the 39th week of pregnancy, and they're paid for by the state. So there isn't a simple pronatalist anti-abortion position going on in Israel, but rather a more complicated picture. And the last book that I'm featuring here is my book, where I show that Haredi women's decisions about childbearing are not solely based on demographics, but also based on financial concerns and family complications. Haredi women use birth control. Hold on a second. And speaking of babies, I apologize. I have one that just walked up. Can you go down and find out, please? Okay. I'm going to say this last piece and then I will text my spouse. Baby up. Okay. The last piece is, hold on a second. So in my book, I'm showing that Haredi women's decisions about childbearing are not solely based on demographics, but also based on financial concerns, family complications. They do use birth control and abortion to reduce the number of children they might have otherwise. And despite these choices, I don't think anyone would say that these women are acting contrary to Jewish continuity, or that they're not committed to Jewish continuity. So what I hope I've been able to show in our time together is that the way we think about continuity in terms of demographics is problematic for a few reasons. The crisis is really about institutions and ideologies, but the blame seems to be placed on reproductive rates. When we start emphasizing reproductive rates above all else, we do harm to many, many Jewish men and women. And second, I would like us to move as a community to a place where we value, this is very crude, not just quantity, but quality. I hope I've shown that historically and currently we value many things that we want to reproduce, excuse the pun. We value education, economic equality, justice, health, bodily autonomy. I would love to see a conversation where we use the language of crisis to draw attention to those issues instead. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I welcome questions.
William?
I'm just wondering whether or not the attitude of the ultra-Orthodox, the Orthodox Haredis towards those who aren't Orthodox affects the actions of the non-Orthodox, both as to reproduction as well as affiliation. I know because of my political stuff in Williamsburg that there are actually some Haredis who consider me not Jewish, even though I'm basically Orthodox reared and tend to that side. And they consider all non-Hasidic to be almost not Jewish. I wonder if that affects the attitudes of the non-Orthodox towards all, and also the fact that the halacha doesn't seem to be as important to the non-Orthodox, sometimes even just disregarding it totally. My son, who went to Hebrew day school in Manhattan, non-Orthodox one, basically has no feeling for the community. He calls himself culturally Jewish. That's a new term, culturally Jewish. But my two questions remain. How do Haredis affect the rest of the Jewish population?
Are you asking, thanks for that. Are you asking whether Haredi attitudes towards non-Haredim affect how non-Haredim are reproducing? Yes, that's your question. I don't know. I don't know. Okay. What I'll say is this. I think most people are aware that some non-Haredim or some Haredim would not view those who are not Haredi as Jewish. Whether this affects the reproductive rates, I don't see a connection there, because reproductive rates are, in the end, rather personal decisions. You know, they have to do a lot with individual financial capacities, personal health, family makeup, things like that. Whether somebody's sitting there and thinking, is it worth having having a baby because the Haredim in Williamsburg don't even consider me Jewish? I haven't heard that as a factor. I'd be very interested to hear if that is going on, because there is a fair amount of keeping up with the Joneses going on, and a way in which reproduction is politicized. So there is a way in which, you know, I have heard arguments of how committed could you be to the Jewish community if you don't have children. But that's precisely the argument that I'm critiquing, and it's actually not convincing other people to have babies. It's making them feel worse, and not wanting to be involved at all. So yeah, I don't know if that's, I haven't seen that connection, but I'd be really curious to hear if you did.
Norman?
Thank you. No question that any congregation that's run by people who consider themselves to be sensitive to Jews who are not like them, the more welcoming congregations are likely to be, the more likely that membership will not only be sustained at current levels, but could grow, which is, you know, which would be good for the congregations. If congregations become more active in what used to be called social action, good chance that perhaps more folks will join the congregation who see that aspect of Jewish teachings to be of a very high priority for them. But nevertheless, and I'm not suggesting that Dr. Raucher is taking this position, but we're still left with the numbers that show that we're not producing at very high rates. And if we're not producing at replacement rates, much less growing rates, then we're going to have a problem.
Okay, so great. Thank you for making that point. So what I would say is the numbers are relevant, but to a point. And what I'm challenging is both the way in which we frame continuity as solely a numbers game, and the way in which we talk about crisis and the way in which we frame this problem as a crisis. And in as much as it therefore obscures other really important factors that the community has held dear for a very long time, right? So in putting those two things together, if we're putting all of our energies into a question of numbers, we're missing a lot that's going on out there, and we're politicizing, right, reproductive choices that are very individual and personal in a way that I don't think is fair either. So I'm not saying the numbers don't matter at all, but I'm saying, number one, they're not the most important thing for continuity. And number two, looking at them objectively, they don't actually rise to the level of crisis. The net Jewish reproductive rate is at replacement level. The question is, are these particular movements reproducing? Is their fertility rate sufficient to sustain the movement? But again, you've got a lot of other factors going into what's sustaining the movement.
Melvin?
Hi. I think that the interesting thing I've observed in my years of experience with Israel, which may or may not have been covered in your study, is the socioeconomic impact of large numbers of unproductive citizens that have been created as a result of a kind of perversion of the original Ben-Gurion policy, which foresaw a much smaller number of people who would devote their lives to this. Now, and you can see this here also in the United States, not only amongst strictly Haredim, but what you might call the yeshivish group of Orthodox, where there is such a virtue on having as many babies as Hashem, wants you to have. That's sort of the attitude. And the male in the families, the value that the whole family, in addition to the male, place on Torah studies is supreme. And somehow, through what the wife might do, through which both families might do, or again, somehow Hashem magically will do that the family will be provided for when it gets to 8, 9, 10, 11 children. The socioeconomic impact of that as a group is probably much more stark in Israel for obvious reasons than it would be in this country.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and it allows me to share this, which is, and I'll just back up for those who aren't familiar with the Ben-Gurion compromise that he made in the 1950s. In exchange for the support of the Haredi parties of the founding of the state, Ben-Gurion agreed to allow, at that time, it was 10,000 yeshiva students to not be drafted into the army and to remain in yeshiva and to receive a stipend from the government. This number has ballooned over the years. I don't know what it is currently, but it's much, 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 much higher. And I'll just point out two things. Number one, Haredim themselves are very much aware of the socioeconomic challenges of this compromise. Women in particular, the women that I spoke to were very aware of it, but the fertility rates overall indicate that they're aware of the fact that that aspect of the community is not able to sustain, the community is not able to sustain itself financially. And here's the interesting numbers. So before 2003, the Haredi reproductive rate in Israel, and this is not in the West Bank. The West Bank has a separate reproductive rate that is interesting for other reasons that we can talk about. But the Haredi reproductive rate in Israel was between 7 and 8 children per family. That was the total fertility rate, which still might seem low to many of you. In 2003, the government drastically reduced the stipends that they provide to Haredi families. And they're actually not just the Haredi families, they're for any family with more than 7 children. They drastically reduced these stipends. They went from about $3,000 a month to about $1,000 a month. Huge drop. After 2003, the numbers that were then gathered in about 2010 indicate that the Haredi fertility rate dropped to between 5 and 7. So it went from 7 to 8 to 5 to 7. That's a huge drop for Haredi families. And it speaks to two things. It speaks to one, Haredi families were aware that with a lower, with less support from the government, they couldn't possibly have as many children as they were going to have, and that it didn't pay to have 7 children if they weren't going to get that bonus from the government. That's number one. But it also speaks to the fact that since 2010, Haredi women have entered the workforce at a much higher rate because the stipends have been reduced from the government. And there's some other research that indicates that more men are entering the workforce as well. There are Haredi universities that have been created in order to train Haredi women in particular to enter the workforce. And that has resulted in a lower fertility rate for Haredi women. So yes, everybody's aware that the community cannot sustain itself at the socioeconomic levels that it was at if they have such high fertility rates. But the fertility rates as a result are adjusting to respond to the lower socioeconomic status of these families because they too need to maintain a living standard. 1 in 4 Haredi families live below the poverty line in Israel. So this was a real problem that Haredi families needed to address and have been addressing. Sorry about the child running behind me. Hold on, I will mute.
Paul?
Thank you. This has just really been fascinating and eye-opening to me in many ways. And I just thought that the people that this is really important to are the people who have the institutional imperative of survival. And I'm wondering, there's definitely, it seems to me, a disparity in viewpoint between the Orthodox and conservative and reform in terms of the priority that reproduction has in their lives. I don't know that anybody would really dispute that it's just a higher priority, whereas it seems to be more of a choice situation among the non-Orthodox. You've just indicated that economics certainly plays a role, but I think it has a more profound impact. The economic issues, the things that others than the Orthodox feel like they need or want to accomplish. And I'm wondering if you believe that the focus of everyone, but particularly the non-Orthodox, needs to be on quality instead of quantity, not just in terms of the Jews that are being produced, but in terms of what it is that Jewish institutions that aren't Orthodox are offering. Do we have any evidence that when you provide quality experiences and opportunities in synagogues, let's say providing childcare and free education, that those things actually increase reproductive rates?
That's a great question. I don't know of any concrete evidence. Maybe some other folks on the call do. But I know, so this statement of Jewish vitality that Sheila Katz responded to makes a lot of suggestions like that. Particularly affordability of day school, which a number of people have pointed out as a factor that prohibits them from having more children if they want their children to be active, or camps, right? Jewish camps, which have been proven to be, these formative Jewish experiences for children. That research is there. I don't know if people are then following up, and that kind of study needs to be longitudinal, right? You need to say, okay, what changes are we making now? And how is this going to affect fertility rates 20 years down the road, right? That's really the kind of research that needs to be done. And I haven't seen that. I'd be very curious to see that kind of thing, because that kind of accessibility, right? In other words, one of the things that we also talk about when we talk about reproduction is people aren't making choices willy-nilly, right? We don't make choices as totally autonomous individual beings, right? We all make choices within limitations, right? We all have limitations on our choices. Some are seen more starkly, but all of us are operating within limited financial resources or family availability or health or whatever it is, right? All of those things are limiting our choices. So if you took out the financial ability as a limitation to having more children or day school or camps or whatever it is, then you'd be freeing up people's choices in different ways. So it wouldn't be, right, when you started your question, it was people don't have as much of a value on reproduction, right? They might have a huge value that they place on reproduction, but all of our choices are made within constraints, right? And if giving children, right, the access to Jewish education, if the goal is to get them into Jewish life, then we have to think about how to make that more accessible so that people's values can match up with the choices that they make.
We've reached our official end time. I don't know if you're able to stay for more questions if people have them.
I think the running toddler has been taken care of, so I think we're good. I can stay on, sure.
Okay, great. So let me just bring us to an official close, and then we can continue Q&A if people would like. So first of all, I just wanted to thank you. What a fascinating, eye-opening session. Thanks for sharing this wisdom with us and research and just penetrating questions about an issue that we think we know.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And just so you all know what a JTS fellow is, a JTS fellow is someone who has had some kind of JTS affiliation, usually an alum of one of our schools. We think is an incredible scholar, teacher, and we have a relationship with them in order to do teaching for the community on behalf of JTS just like this. So we're thrilled to have you as a JTS fellow. For next week's session, we have also an outstanding JTS fellow, Dr. Edna Friedberg, who's going to be teaching on the literature of the ghetto. So her session is called Literature as Lifeline, What Were Jews Reading and Writing in the Ghettos? And she's going to be talking about literature as a form of spiritual sustenance in a time of obvious crisis. So I hope you'll join us for that, which is next Monday, June 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And thanks so much to everyone for coming. And again, thanks, Dr. Raucher, for sticking around for more Q&A, and we can continue. Thanks, everyone.
If somebody sent me a question privately, I can't get to it right now, but feel free to email me. By the way, if you can't stay on right now, if we don't get to it, I'll post my email in the chat.
Alan?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Raucher. This is such important research that you're doing, and thank you for doing it and making JTS proud. My wife just went on the board, so she enjoyed it too before she had to go back to work. She's a Smith graduate, so she, needless to say, really, really appreciated this. I wonder if, when continuing with the quality versus quantity, I wonder if outreach and programming for interfaith marrieds is one example of where the numbers did change, because I know Sylvia Barrett-Fishman, right after the first national Jewish population came out, everybody was crying Gewalt, and the children of interfaith marriage are not going to be Jewish, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, people started doing, especially the reform movement, welcoming interfaith couples, allowing children to procreate, and all of a sudden, what do you know? Boston did that famous study, and what do you know? Now interfaith marriages are engaging. So what is that fact? Do you agree with that? And what are the implications for our movement, which is, although we finally beat the reform movement and having a woman as a chancellor, we finally beat them. Nonetheless, we're still behind the 8 ball with welcoming interfaith families in a really significant way.
That's a great question. And I would point you to the rest of the Pew survey. So Pew did collect all this data about the movements and their populations and things like that. And I would that's where the fertility conversation just doesn't tell the full story about the success of these movements and what programs are working and what's not. So the Pew survey, has those other data points. And if you compare it to the NJPS of 1990 to see, the size of the movements, you might get some indication of what works. But the other thing that I would recommend is I have a couple of colleagues who have done great work on interfaith marriages, some on Jewish-Hindu relationships, and some on Jewish-Christian relationships. And they're really telling a much more rich story about what's going on in these families, what affects their affiliation with the movements. And again, email me, I'll get you the names of those books as well. Samira Mehta's book in particular came out just recently, and she does great work on this particular thing. She's also doing some work on, some of you might be involved in grandparents programs at your synagogue. She's doing some wonderful work on seeing sort of the efficacy of these kinds of programs as well. So again, I'm an anthropologist. I'm a big advocate for that kind of another use of quality, that kind of qualitative research, because it just tells a richer story than the numbers actually tell.
Dale?
Oh, I wanted to react, well, just want to hear a little more about your thoughts or what might be done about child-free or single people in the Jewish community to improve continuity. Because it seems to me, I thought a bit about this, part of the issue is making synagogue life and making Jewish communal life attractive to a wide variety of people. I think that's where you started, but we haven't heard a lot about it as the time went on. So I just wondered if you could talk a little more about it.
You're looking for some more suggestions, things that would make child-free families more welcome in Jewish life. That's a great question. I wish I had better suggestions. Maybe some people on the call do. You know, I unfortunately don't do so much sort of constructive building Jewish community work. So other people would definitely have better suggestions for you. Maybe you have some yourself that you'd like to share. I think you're muted.
No, I hadn't anticipated having an answer. I'm actually looking for answers. I think your idea about looking at fees is really important. I think the fee structure by household definitely is a disincentive, but I also think something could be done in terms of helping or encouraging child-free people or people who do not have families to have an actual role in Judaism and in communal life, and to participate in, you know, bringing others in, being part of a community. And I think if that were done, it would be helpful to general continuity, because part of the problem is people aren't bringing people in, as happens in other groups that I'm part of, or in many cases, people aren't bringing people in.
Right, right. And as we saw from some of the statements made on the source sheet, right, people are waiting for people to have kids and then to get involved in congregations. But the other thing I will point out is that there is an American-wide context for Judaism. That's kind of obvious. Let me be more specific. American religion, various American religious movements, youth, ages 18 to 25, generally disengage from institutionalized religion. That is a trend that my colleagues who study a variety of American religions point to. So the Jewish community seems to be overly focused on assuming people are getting married around sort of using these actually outdated figures for marriage in the Jewish community, right? Assuming people are getting married around the age of 25, which is not the case by and large in the Jewish community. But assuming that you get married at 25 and then you'll slowly make your way back into Jewish institutions because you'll have kids and you'll need, programming for them and et cetera, et cetera. But it's a really outdated model for the timeline for when people are going to get involved in your institutions. But it's also neglecting the fact that that trend is really America-wide. And so we need a way, if you're interested in keeping these institutions afloat, then you want to get people back involved when they're 25 in a way that doesn't depend on them having kids. right? And then hopefully your thinking will expand, right? So you're not just thinking about a 25-year-old who doesn't have kids. Maybe you're thinking about a 40-year-old who doesn't have kids, a 50-year-old who doesn't have kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing I will just add is, and this is from the research I've been doing among Orthodox women who are getting ordained, you know, because of the pressure to reproduce, talking about fertility challenges was very taboo. Talking about miscarriage was really taboo. And one of the things that, you know, when I study Orthodox women who have been ordained, one of the things that their congregants talk about a lot is the fact that that's the first time when they had they refer to them as maharats or rabbanits or rabbah. They use a variety of titles. But when that female religious leader got up on the bima for the first time and talked about her fertility challenges or her miscarriage, it was the first time anybody had ever spoken publicly about those realities. And that went a long way towards normalizing that reality for the community. So I think so if we could just draw a parallel, right, there's a lot to be said about the way in which our religious leaders talk about children and reproduction and women and people who don't have children and all of these things in a different way, right? We could encourage them to child-free people in our congregation as well. I think that might go a long way as well.
Sherry?
Miller, because there's another Sherry.
Yeah.
Okay. One thing I wrote under chat, and I still think it's true in many ways, is that you can't offer everything to everyone because ultimately you don't have anything. For example, it's not the only example, but let's say for the interfaith couples, why are you giving individuals who have chosen not to reject the faith, but why are you giving a person who is not a Jew the same right or roughly the same rights as someone who is a Jew, whose children are Jewish? That's not right because you're devaluing the act itself. For example, bar or bat mitzvah, for example. Personally, you know, okay, I'm unmarried currently. I'm single, all right? I very rarely have a problem being a single woman because what I look for, and there's nothing unique in a way about it, perhaps there is, I look for things in a synagogue that will pique my interests, Jewishly, whatever that field happens to be. Why do I have to gear myself for children? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but you have to provide something that will sustain the parents before they can feel they can even offer anything to the children. Because when you see the parent, him or herself, getting involved in certain activities, that's your role model, in a sense, to participate. Not necessarily, I'm not saying this is an all-inclusive solution to anything, but offer the things that challenge my mind, or if I had a husband, my husband's mind. Then we can really offer something to our children, or talk about it with someone who may not be Jewish, but who, actually I did meet someone who has, it seems like perhaps for her personal interest, the same kind of interest that I do as a Jew. I just don't like the idea of having to cater to everyone, because it comes a point where you have to have some exclusivity rather than inclusivity, because I don't want to see what we have devalued on some level.
Thank you for those comments, Sherry Miller. Thank you very much. You know, I understand that perspective. I think that I get nervous around, you know, the idea that somehow including people will lessen what we have or dilute what we have. I think, you know, and this partially comes from my experiences and also from, you know, my anthropological research. We're actually we're all very, very different in ways that are surprising and exciting and rich. And I think that what we have is strong. I don't think that it will be weakened in any way. I think what we have depends on the people who are involved. And if somebody's choosing to be involved, I want to hear what they have to offer. That's where I'm coming from. I respect different perspectives. If I didn't convince you, that's fine too. I can't possibly convince everyone, but that's where I'm coming from.
Stephen?
Yes, I was actually director of Jewish continuity at the Atlanta Jewish Federation in the mid-1990s, and I can say that our focus at that time was on promoting day school education, Jewish camps, youth groups, Israel experience, volunteerism, social action, religious involvement, observance, et cetera, a whole range of different activities and involvements. And frankly, the issue of being pronatal never even occurred to us. It just wasn't on our agenda. And I suspect maybe that was because we just saw it as just never entered our minds. And maybe it was because we didn't see it as the responsibility or role or place of the Jewish community to put a value on that it was a strictly personal kind of decision. Now, having said that, fast forwarding to today in Atlanta, there exists an organization called the Jewish Fertility Foundation. And its focus is on helping infertile Jewish couples to have children through various different, scientific, medical, health interventions, and trying to raise money from the Jewish community to support and to help pay for those kinds of interventions because they're so expensive to help couples. That seems to be an appropriate kind of response, and that we shouldn't be, urging. And I assume, and I don't, even today, I don't see this, frankly. I've never seen this in conservative or reform or, Reconstructionist congregations, anybody saying, have more children. I mean, I do associate that, certainly with the Orthodox community, but not at all. I've not seen it within the non-Orthodox community. And this seems like, helping infertile couples seems like an appropriate way for the community, let's say the non-Orthodox or liberal Jewish community, to be supportive in that vein. So I'll just put that out there and invite you to comment and react to that.
Great, Stephen, thank you so much for that comment. So I think what you said raises a number of issues. One, I think clearly the national conversation obscure actions that were going on that might not have been on their face aimed at encouraging reproduction, but do seem, maybe I don't remember the exhaustive list, but they do seem focused on children. The actions that you did in Atlanta. So in some way there was a children focus to the idea of continuity. But the other thing that I'll point out is, a lot of, you may never have had this experience, but I will say that I have had this experience. I know a lot of people have, of being a woman and walking into a congregation that is not Orthodox, and them asking you, when are you having a baby? How many babies do you have? When are you having another baby? That is also part of cultural messaging. And the, the fact that people feel empowered to say those types of things to women is an indication of the fact that they feel supported by larger messaging. So I'll say that one thing, but there was something else in what you said. I'm forgetting. Remind me something else that you said.
Well, I want to say also that our focus was not exclusively on children. Yes, there was a lot also on family education, but a lot on adult education. There was a lot of involvement in those areas as well. We brought in the Melton program, and people were also involved in MEA and a number of other, and we had a major Wexner group in Atlanta. So a lot of and college and Hillel was a major focus. So a number of different areas.
Great, wonderful. That's